who's part of our group and very much our local resident on ancient history, who's going to talk to us today about really ancient place names and the derivations of, which will encompass, so what on earth is a Ropley? I think I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes, and then there'll be time for questions and answers at the end. Thank you.
Round of applause. Round of applause for Carol. Right, let's see if this works. Hello? Oh, it needs a battery, that's why. One sec. There we go. Sorry about that. Round of applause for Carol. Yes, hello everyone. I always like to start by thanking everyone for coming. It's amazing to see so many faces, most of which are unfamiliar. Yes, a little bit about myself, perhaps. In fact, I might just turn up the volume really quickly. Sorry. My name is Manny. I've lived locally for about 14 years, the past 2 years of which I've been at university studying archaeology. And I've always had an interest for history, old things, archaeology in general. And as a part of that fascination for history is my fascination for local history. And an important part of my research in the past few years has been the local place names. Now, I find that we take place names for granted. I think everyone goes through their day-to-day without even realizing the times when they use place names, or might not even think what a place name is. For me, place names, seeing that I've researched them for the past 5 years, are fascinating things because they are quite literally moments frozen in time. So in periods where we have very few records, very few details of day-to-day life, place names can offer us actually an insight into these ancient worlds, because place names at the end of the day are just descriptions of places. And you yourself, without maybe even realizing, have invented your own place names, your own nicknames for family homes, your own nicknames for woodlands, for shops even, for restaurants. Those are place names because they are descriptions for you that you and maybe your community and your family know very well. So ultimately, that's all these place names are, albeit they were place names for larger groups for pieces of land. So ultimately, a place name is just a name for a geographical thing, an entity. So, why have I called this talk, What is a Ropley? What is a Ropley anyway? Like Carol said, I'm going to talk in detail about some place names, a selected handful, from Ropley, West Tisted, Foremarks, Farringdon, some other places as well, to outline what this ancient landscape might have looked like. Now, I'm not talking about 1 year in specific, I'm not even talking about a century. I'm talking about centuries of what these landscapes look like. So what these landscapes look like to the very earliest Anglo-Saxon settlers of southern England, what these landscapes looked like to farmers of the 18th and 19th centuries, and what these landscapes looked like to medieval peasants. So this isn't just one moment in time, these are many, many frozen moments in time. So let's begin, if I can work out how. Excuse me. That's not working. Or is that? No, there we go. So, if any of you have spent any amount of time or have lived in Ropley, you'll notice Ropley isn't your typical village. It's not comprised of its typical village centre with the odd hamlet and mostly farms surrounding it. No, Ropley is a sprawling rural mass. It's a rural sprawl, as I like to call it, rather than an urban sprawl. And this is because of something I like to quote, I'm not sure who it's by. It's because geology is destiny. And I'm sure some of you know, Ropley is situated on the western flank of the East Hampshire Ridge, an area of particular dryness. So there's no natural streams in this area, in this parish, there's no natural rivers, no large lakes, only small ponds. And this geology was the destiny for the future settlement which followed. What do I mean? Well, there was no large cluster, there was no one village. Rather, there were smaller hamlets scattered around which fed off ponds, naturally occurring ponds and dew ponds, and occasionally wells as well. So this is what I mean by geology is destiny. But from this modern map, the picture is quite unclear. We see the sprawl and each hamlet almost fades into the other. So I'm going to have to twist the map and do my signature fade in of an older map. This is Ropley in around 1839. I'll just zoom out a little bit. And here you can see much clearer that Ropley is made up of quite a number of hamlets, which are all quite distinct from one another. So just to list a few, in the middle we have the heart of Ropley, Church Street, so just around the corner, just up there. To the north we have North Street. Some of you might recognise that from driving down from Fourmarks, down the A31. To the south we have South Street. To the east we have Hawthorne, which is now in Fourmarks. We have Charlwood in the east. In the middle we have Gilbert Street. In the west we have Dean, the Ropley Dean. We have Monkwood, Kitwood, which is now in Fourmarks, Ropley Soak, and Fourmarks. And with Fourmarks, I'd like to start. So if we zoom in on this corner of the map, this is what Fourmarks looked like 180 years ago. Really just 3-4 properties, 1 or 2 farms. Absolutely nothing compared to what it is today. If you don't know Fourmarks very well, pretty much every single empty plot of land here is absolutely dense with houses. But what does Fourmarks mean? What is a Fourmarks even? Well, for that, I've chosen this map from 1895. You can see a few more houses, but still a very, very empty hamlet. Fourmarks is quite a new settlement, as you can see from these maps, and was likely probably not settled until the end of the 18th century. At least this part of Fourmarks wasn't. But there were the odd hamlet and farm that were in its modern-day boundaries. But why is it called Fourmarks? What is a Fourmarks? Well, if we trace these dotted lines around, we'll see that Fourmarks actually didn't exist as a parish in its own right at this point. In fact, it didn't even exist until 1932 when it was created, if you will. But from this map, we can see quite clearly that Fourmarks is situated right where these 4 parishes meet, and indeed, that's where its name comes from. Fourmarks quite literally translates as the 4 parish boundaries, the 4 marks, literally mark being a border. And I always like showing this picture as a symbol of Fourmarks. It shows quite a number of things. Not only does it show the only known picture of the Fourmarks stone, this parish boundary was actually a stone at some point until the 1960s when it was unfortunately destroyed. But it also shows the tradition of beating the bounds. Now, if you came to my last talk, you might have heard this, so I'll just repeat it briefly again for those of you who weren't there. Beating the bounds is probably in origin medieval tradition where parishioners would go around the border of their village, and with every single boundary marker that they saw, they would refresh them and clean them. Why were there boundary markers in this time, you might ask? Well, in the medieval period, even up until the 1800s, maps were not widespread at all. They existed, but they were only used by the elite and the landowners. Your peasant, your day-to-day person would never have seen a map, probably in their entire life. So to navigate and to realize where they were and in which parish they were, they needed boundary markers so that they could clearly see in which parish they were. This was important because if you encroached, if you illegally farmed in territory that wasn't yours, you could be charged with a hefty fine or possibly even hung in earlier times. So it's very important in this time. So as a tradition to make sure that everyone in the parish remembered where they were, they would basically perambulate, walk around the borders of a village. And with each marker that they saw, they would refresh it, they'd clean it, they'd replace it, and they'd mark it with a new one in some cases. And in this case, the parishioners of this case, Chawton, went to the Fourmarks stone and performed another tradition called bumping. And you can see bumping in the middle consists of lowering, sometimes aggressively, sometimes not so aggressively, certain parishioners on these boundary markers. Usually it was younger members, so I think in this case they've done almost a comedic thing and picked one of the older members. You probably can't see it, it's quite pixelated, I apologise. They've in this case picked the rector of Chawton, probably a man in his 70s at this point, to bump, to place on the stone, so he remembers and he doesn't forget where the stone is. But that's why I like this picture. And indeed, this is the boundary surgery. If you ever drive through Fourmarks, this is roughly opposite the co-op, and the woman on the right-hand side of the picture is standing on what is now the A31, so just to orient yourself. And the first time Fourmarks is mentioned, as I say, because it was unsettled, is from 1550, which might sound quite long ago to us, about 500 years ago, but is very recent in terms of local history. And that's because, as it says in this description, Fourmarks was an empty piece of land. But it is interestingly described as being near Bookmere. Now, some of you might not have heard of Bookmere, but if I show you the modern spelling of the name, it might ring a few bells. Bogmore Close is located between Blackberry Lane and the A31. It's quite a small cul-de-sac. But indeed, it's pretty much the third or fourth oldest name in Fourmarks and translates from Old English as the Beech Tree Pond. And this is what I mean. These are the moments frozen in time. You can go up and down this lane, you won't see a beech tree, nor will you see a pond. But the name preserves this tree, which may have only stood for 50, 100 years or so. And it preserves it for eternity, basically. And this pond as well. This pond was here until the 1800s, so it was there maybe for about 1,000 or so years, maybe even older, but it's certainly not there today. So that's what I mean. These moments frozen in time, they're fascinating. And in a time, especially in Formarks, where we don't have any descriptions, no photos, no maps of the area before the 1800s, we can say, well, there was a pond with a beech tree here. That's a really amazing description that we don't get from a lot of historical sources. But as I said, these ponds were vital for local settlement. So there were many of these ponds, and they would have been known to local communities who would have named each and every pond they came across. And to distinguish one pond from another, they'd use other factors that described it. So in one case, it was the pond next to the beech tree, but it was different from the pond next to the willow tree, which is what Weathermore means. And that's at the other side of Formarks. It's, again, another dead-end lane with a few modern developments on it. But indeed, if you carry on further down this lane and you go into Weathermore Copse, you'll come across a big puddle. But indeed, this big puddle is actually a very ancient pond, at least Anglo-Saxon, because again, it is preserved in this place name. So Weathermore quite literally refers to that blue splash there, which is still visible today. And now to get in some audience participation, because I'm thirsty. Does anyone have an idea of what pond this is? Hands up. Very good, unanimous. It is Swelling Hill in around the 1910s. But you might be interested to see this, this pond, not pond, you wouldn't be interested to see the pond, this house in the background. This house was built in around the 1850s or 1860s, from what I can deduce, but burnt down, according to records, in around the 1930s. But there is one major thing left of this house, and that's the big platform it once stood on. So for orientation, this track at the bottom right corner of the lane, that is Swelling Hill Lane, and the car park is just outside of the image, or what the car park is today. It's just outside of the postcard. And when you park up, you might be familiar with the plateau or the terrace that's in front of you. There's a bit of an earthwork in front of you. That was the basis, the foundation of this house, basically. And you can see it in this picture quite well. You can see how the edges slope up to meet the house. So there you go. But what does Swelling Hill mean? Swelling Hill likely has no connection to the pond, as in the name doesn't. It's first recorded in 1403 as Swirling, and derives from the Old English, again Anglo-Saxon word swelgund, and translates as the abyss. A very dark name, but if you've ever paddled in Swelling Hill Pond, you'll know that the pond is anything but abyss-like. You probably cross the pond with only getting your toes wet. Indeed, it refers to Swelling Hill Lane, which you can see in a postcard from the 1910s, on the right, and you can see how abyss-like the lane works with its cliff-like edges. And how did this lane form? Well, partially through human wear, partially through lots of footfall, but secondarily through the course of an ancient river. Now, some of you, if you went to my earlier talk, might know, but Swelling Hill was an ancient spring, and it was an ancient water source, and it still is a spring, although not a very productive one. And one of the tributaries from Swelling Hill would have gone down Swelling Hill Lane and would have eventually joined the Arle, somewhere near Bishop Sutton, and then gone on via the Itchen down to the Solent. So this is an ancient riverbed, if you can imagine. And that's why its edges are so deep. Now, if you continue down Swelling Hill, you'll come to Gilbert Street. Here you can see the Gilbert Street shop, which I'm not sure when it was demolished. I think it was there even until the 1950s or 60s. Don't take my word for it. But what does Gilbert Street mean? If you saw my poster, you might be enthralled. But unfortunately, there was no Gilbert behind the Gilbert Street, or not a Gilbert, rather Gilberts. And that's the Gilbert family of Ropley, who I believe might even still live in the parish today. I'm not sure, but they certainly were here in the 1920s. The Gilbert family are likely, possibly one of the oldest families in Ropley, as in the oldest family that have continuously lived here, because they're first recorded in 1203. Interestingly enough, their name is actually of Norman descent, and indeed we can see that this wealth, because typically the Normans that settled the British Isles after the Norman conquest were quite wealthy, this wealth actually spanned across the centuries, and up until the 1800s, the Gilberts, which were quite a big family at that point, were recorded owning quite a lot of land, quite a lot of farms. And they were probably so notorious at some point that they actually came to take over the name of, before this it's actually known as Town Street, they then superseded that older name with their surname, Gilbert Street, in around 1500. But you might think, you know, the meaning of street, of Gilbert Street, but as a matter of fact, the street, the second element of the name, has very little to do with the lane or road itself, but is rather an ancient Anglo-Saxon word for a settlement on a roadside. So if you see rural examples of this street, There are some examples in Priors Dean, Colmore, where there's basically no settlement on it, but it's still called a street. You can almost certainly say for sure that there was a medieval settlement here at some point. But you might know of some other streets in Ropley as well. I like to call it the streets of Ropley. Gilbert Street here in the middle, North Street to the north, South Street to the south, and Church Street in the middle. And you'll notice all these streets, they're not just streets, they are hamlets, they are settlements in and of themselves. North Street is first mentioned in 1347 and seems to be the site of quite a wealthy family, the Mayhew family, who are actually originally from Alresford. I think Hilary wrote an article about the Mayhew family, well worth a read on our website. And again, this is derived from the Anglo-Saxon word straight, meaning the settlement on a road. And this road, the A31 today, was even back in the medieval period quite a major thoroughfare that led from Alresford to Alton. Here we can see the nice, I believe, 17th century, 18th century North Street farm, which unfortunately burnt down in 1937, but this is one of the last known photos of it. Equally, on the other side of Church Street, we have South Street, which is first recorded in 1459, and again, basically refers to its location south of the main hamlet of Ropley on Church Street. And you can see South Street was actually quite a significant hamlet in the 1830s, and it was actually quite a large hamlet since the late medieval period, and is recorded frequently in documents. It seems to be basically the second largest area of settlement in Ropley at this time. Now on to Church Street. This is probably my favourite bit of our archive. It might not seem like much, but this is a roughly 200-year-old painting of Ropley, which is the oldest depiction of a scene in Ropley. So this predates photography, this predates films and so on, obviously. And it shows, I think, the most beautiful, the most quaint village scene you can imagine. Various villagers going around their daily life. You can see dogs, cows, cattle, pig, children playing. And we can date this painting quite well to around the early 1800s because this pigsty, just here, was demolished in the 1870s. And this house was built in the 1770s. So we can say it's roughly in those 100 years, and this bears great similarity, the layout of the houses and so on, to a map from 1839. So we could say it's the early 1800s. But again, Church Street, what does it mean? It, like the others, just implies this settlement on a roadside, but implies the settlement of a roadside near where a church stood. Surprisingly mentioned quite late, in 1550, as I say, 500 years is a short time in local history, but is indeed basically the main artery of Ropley. This is the Ropley, if you will. But Ropley itself, interestingly, was a hamlet of Bishop Sutton until the 1880s, legally speaking. In fact, the parish of Ropley didn't exist until 1888. This is because, again, the area's population wasn't as large in the Anglo-Saxon period, and it gradually grew over the centuries, until around actually the 1400s, when Ropley became far larger than Bishop Sutton for reasons unbeknownst to researchers so far. It might be that the plague actually affected Bishop Sutton quite poorly, but either way, we know by the 1300s and 1400s that Ropley is actually quite a larger, as in terms of population, and also a wealthier place, which is quite interesting. But there we have it, the streets of Ropley. And you can see again here quite clearly how fragmented the hamlets are. And again, if we use our knowledge of the place names, these moments frozen in time, we can imagine a densely forested area with these roads cutting through, with some hamlets, some roadside settlements intermitting the thick forest. Continuing on from Church Street is Lieway. Now, Lieway is mentioned relatively early in 1327 and derives from the Old English words lee and wee, and basically means the way to the woodland clearing. But what woodland clearing is this? Well, under my own research, Lieway quite literally translates as the Ropley Lane, or if you want to translate it again, it basically means the lane to Ropley, and implies that Lieway, this ancient route, this road, is as old as Anglo-Saxon times. And it could even be older. If you look at how straight the road is on a map, you might even be inclined to call it a Roman road, which you might not be wrong in saying. And we're very fortunate to have a map of Lieway from 1678. And this is the oldest map of Ropley. It doesn't show quite a lot. It shows some field names, which is quite interesting for my research. But it also shows Lieway Farm in the middle, which is shown here quite nicely. Now, if you thought the Lieway lane to the woodland clearing was funny, You might be also amused to hear that Berry Hill translates as the Hill Hill. That's because Berry quite literally means an Old Saxon hill. Fun fact. But continuing on eastward from Lyeway is Charlwood. And Charlwood these days is actually quite a small hamlet. It's one of the very few hamlets to have actually shrunken in the past years. But Charlwood in the 1830s, which you can see at this map on the right, was actually made up of around 11 or 12 properties, which is quite significant. And it's likely due to industrialisation, possibly even the war, that this hamlet shrunk, because the shrinkage actually started in around 1910. And as I say, there are now only 2 or 3 properties left. It translates from Old English Chiol and Wudu to the wood of the free peasants. And although it doesn't directly refer to settlement, it does imply the possibility of a local settlement. So we could say that the hamlet might be as old as 1327, although, again, with all of these things, we need archaeological research to be sure of this. Again, we are very fortunate enough to have a map of Charlwood from the 1630s. Now, obviously this looks very modern. That's because I've traced over quite a poor tracing from the 1950s. And it shows the East Tisted side of Charlwood. So if any of you have ever been on a walk there, you might notice that one half is in Ropley and the other half is in East Tisted. And that's why this map on the right looks so weird and is made up of 2 colours, because I had to cut the map, not literally. I've had to cut half of the map from the East Tisted 1840 map and the other half from the Ropley 1839 map. And that's what we see in this pitch. That's why we only see half of the page, really, because this is the East Tisted side of Charlwood. And even in the 1630s, it was more populated than it was today, and even had a brick kiln, which you can see spelt as Breakwell. So we have Hyde's house. The Hyde family seem to have been in East Tisted for some centuries at this point. We have the Reelfords. There's only one Reelford mentioned this time, Robert Reelford, so we can be pretty sure that Robert Reelford lived in that house. And this third house, where it says Breakwell, is unlabelled as to who lives there, but it is still standing today. It's Charlwood House, if you're ever in that area. It's a very pretty 17th century house, and the only fragment of this original Charlwood. All the other houses have since been demolished, destroyed, or succumbed to the plough or woodland. South of Charlwood is Monkwood, which some of you might know, might even live in. But the original Monkwood didn't refer to the area where you likely live today, so around Petersfield Road. Rather, the original Monkwood actually referred to the settlement around Smuggler's Lane. So if any of you know Smuggler's Cottage, a very quaint little cottage basically hidden at the bottom of this lane, that's basically where this original Monkwood was. And indeed, Smuggler's Lane is a relatively modern name. The earliest mention I can actually find is in the 1920s, so it seems to be very young. Indeed, before then it was actually called Monk Dean Lane. In fact, there are many place names around Monkwood preserved in older records which label Monkwood, Monkton, Mungdean, Monkton, various names that imply the presence of either a hermitage, so a small community of monks here, or more likely a large amount of land owned by Newark Priory, who are recorded owning this land in the 1550s, which is quite interesting. And west of Monkwood is Stapley Lane. Now, Stapley Lane, believe it or not, is actually the oldest name in Ropley, and it's recorded first in 941, so 1,100 and something years ago. And indeed, the thing I find most fascinating is our pronunciation of the lane has stayed the same. So it's not pronounced Stapley Lane as I originally thought, it's actually pronounced Stapley Lane because the original Anglo-Saxon pronunciation was Stapolweg. And indeed, Stapley Lane is actually also a relatively modern reimagination of the name, and it was actually known as Staple Way up until even the 1800s, and here you can see in the 1720s as Staple Way, or Staple Way, sorry. What does it mean? Well, it comes from the Old English word stapo, meaning the pole, and way, meaning the lane or the way. So it means the pole way, which likely refers to some sort of property which stood on the side of this lane, which was palisaded, so surrounded by a fence of poles. And here you can see on a map of 1759, Stapley Lane is pretty much the only shown route between West Tisted and Ropley, and basically shows that it was quite a major thoroughfare between these two very closely interlinked communities. Another ancient name that has now been lost, most of you will probably not know of it, is Hatman Wood. Hatman Wood's actually just in West Tisted, but parts of it were also in Ropley in later records. And again, it's recorded in this very old Anglo-Saxon charter. More on that later. And what does it mean? It translates to Hatter's Enclosure. So again, these moments frozen in time, this charter is particularly nice because it describes the boundaries of West Tisted in great detail and basically says from well, I'm paraphrasing here, it doesn't actually say this, from John's house to Lucas's woodland, from Lucas's woodland to the tree where adders thrive to, for example, the stream which floods frequently. So, things like that. So it's a very vivid description, and again, in a time far before maps, the Anglo-Saxon period, there are no maps. It is a beautiful and vivid description, which is why these place names are so important for research. And on that note, here is West Tisted in around 1845. And this boundary, which we see here, this roughly triangular shape, this maybe semicircular shape, has remained unchanged since these very early descriptions of its boundaries in the 940s AD. Sorry, yes. So all of these boundaries are described very vividly in this 10th century perambulation charter, as it's actually known. And some names are still actually translatable. So for example, Stapley Lane is still there, Clinkley Lane, if you know that. There's also a possibility that Hill Farm Road, which leads from Petersfield Road, is also possibly recorded in this early document. And West Tisted itself is a very ancient village. However, if you go to West Tisted today, you'll notice there are barely any old houses. That's because West Tisted is an example of an abandoned medieval village. So possibly, we're not sure, possibly around the time of the plague, the Black Death, West Tisted experienced a massive population decline. And likely before this, it was actually one of the largest settlements in the area. But because of the plague and possibly some other factors, the population declined and West Tisted became so small that actually today it's, I think it's the church parishes of West Tisted and Ropley are actually combined. And if you go through West Tisted today, I think you can count the amount of houses on 2 hands. And maybe a foot as well. What about West Tisted itself? Well, West Tisted is mentioned even earlier than these early mentions. It's described in another perambulation from West Meon, where it's described as Tisted. And again, we have this moment frozen in time. So what does Tisted mean? It means Teacher's farmstead. Teacher was some sort of a patriarch, a father maybe, a landowner, we're not sure, who owned a farmstead and possibly the land around it. And maybe he was such a important and well-known chap that he was used to describe the whole area, and that name stuck for 1,100 years, and stuck so much that the neighbouring village, which didn't have a name, East Tisted, stole the name, pretty much. And that's the origin of East Tisted. East Tisted wasn't actually settled until around the 1200s, we think. Again, audience participation. Within West Tisted, you might have heard of Cannondale. Now, can anyone hazard a guess to the origin, the meaning behind Cannondale? That's the, as I like to say, the folklore story behind it. So Cannondale, fascinatingly, again, has a very early map record, so 1676, sorry, when it was part of the property of St Mary Magdalene College in Oxford. But they actually came to own the land through its previous owners, being Selborne Priory. And that's actually where the name comes from. So Cannondale has very little to do with an actual canon, but rather the canons of Selborne Priory. So it's, I think it's a ecclesiastical term for some sort of high-ranking monk. I'm not familiar with that. So Cannondale quite literally translates to the chalk pit that belonged to the canons of Selborne Priory. But it's so interesting that over all these years, we come up with our own stories. So we forget the initial meanings of these place names and we come up with what is called a folk etymology for these places. So the folk etymology here being that I think originally the story was there was a skirmish nearby and cannons were found in this woodland. So that was a way for the local population to explain this place name that had clearly been forgotten over the centuries. And another trick name in Formarks is Battle Copse. Another similar theory was contrived there at some point, maybe in the 1800s or 1900s, and it was supposedly the site of another skirmish, but the reality is much more boring, which you find in local history. It just belonged to a family called the Battle family, who are recorded in Farringdon as early as 1704. And another folklore, another folk etymology, is of Bridestone Lane in Farringdon. And if you came to my past talk, you might have heard the story already, so I apologise. There is not far from Ropley, Bridestone Lane. Once upon a time, there was a wedding, and the terrible mistake, as it turned out, was made of not inviting the fairies of the neighbourhood to the festivities. On the way home from the church, the whole wedding party was turned into stones. These large blocks of conglomerate may still be seen by the lane side. So the original meaning of Bridestone Lane had been forgotten, which I will get onto in a bit. It's a very boring name. And they found these actually geologically very interesting stones on the side of the lane. Now, these blocks of conglomerate are actually called pudding stone, and they're geologically, they do naturally occur, so they haven't been transported here, but they're actually a process of glaciation. So they heard the word Brightstone and they saw these stones and they thought, well, there must be some sort of connection here. So I did promise the real boring explanation. And that is, it probably just derives from the Old English meaning, the hill where young fowl are kept. Bridder's Dun, which turned into Bridder's Dun, which turned into Bridestone, which turned into Brightstone Lane. So, unfortunately, a very dull explanation. But there are indeed many folklore stories surrounding these stones, that these stones were used by 18th century and 19th century carting teams to see who was the fastest, who had the fastest horses, whose horse could carry the stone the furthest. There are many stories surrounding these stones. And to stay on the topic of stones, we have Stancombe Lane, which actually is the other way around for these. So this might sound like an initially boring meaning, but actually has a very interesting possible meaning. So Stancombe is first recorded in 1256. For those of you who don't know, Stancombe's in Medstead, the west of Medstead near Byton, and translates quite simply as the Stony Valley, from Stan, Old English for stone, and Combe for valley. Combe is still used as a dialectical word for a valley in some parts of the West Country, and in here as well. However, I did promise a more tempting etymology, and that's the Roman road valley. You see this map, and you know anything about Roman roads is you know Roman roads are straight. And indeed, these maps show very straight roads, in fact, a collection of quite straight roads. But what has this got to do with with stones in the Stony Valley? Well, like I say, place names were very important for people. They were used to basically navigate a landscape. So if you wanted to get from one place to another, you could look for this descriptive word in the landscape and then you could go there. Or if you were a landowner and you wanted to know what bit of land you owned and your neighbour owned, you could just simply look at the land and you could see, well, that's the Stony Valley, he owns that. Problem is, every single valley here is stony, and there are many valleys which are stony, so Stancombe on its own is not a very descriptive name, sort of like the lane or the hill. It doesn't describe a lot. So that's why I think it refers to the Roman roads. But that still doesn't explain stone, stan, what's the connection? Well, stan is actually used quite frequently when describing Roman roads by these early Anglo-Saxon settlers. This is because when they first came to the British Isles, the first things they came across, or the first good roads they saw, were metalled by the Romans, these gorgeous stone roads. So the first things they named these places was the stone places, because they were quite neatly packed stones. And I think that is the etymology, the meaning of this place name. And indeed, archaeological research has proven that parts of this lane are indeed of Roman origin. Now, some of you might not have even have heard of Harkham, which I don't blame you for. It's quite a tucked away mannerly house, a stately house on the side of Parkside Lane in sort of the southwest of Ropley. But Harkham is one of the oldest names of Ropley, recorded in around 1208, and translates from Old English, this Anglo-Saxon language, as the valley where goats are kept. Again, very vivid description. However, it is more interesting than this, because in this record, where it is first mentioned in 1208, and it is also frequently mentioned in the next few years, it's actually used as an element of a surname. Now, before our modern invention, if you will, of surnames, in the medieval period, they were much more flexible, and you could be given a surname for all sorts of reasons. So one of the reasons, or one of the ways you might be given a surname is because of a distinct feature you had. You might have been tall, in which case you might be called Long or Tall. You might have been very strong, so you might be called Armstrong. You might be called all manner of things. You might have been named after one of your parents. Your father might have been a John or an Ander or an Andrew, so you might be Anderson, Johnson, those sorts of things. Or, I'll give you another example, you could be named after a profession. You might be the archer, you might be the tailor, you might be the cobbler. So that's where we get a lot of our modern surnames from. But there was also a fourth option, and that was you were named after the land you lived on or the land you owned. And that's what we see here. So Havercombe is actually used as the surname suffix of 4 individuals: a Henry of Havercombe, a John of Havercombe, a Joanna of Havercombe, and a William of Havercombe. So we have 4 names from one place, which really does describe a dense population, if not a hamlet, at this time. However, if you've ever been there now, or probably proven by the fact that you might not even know its existence, Harkham shriveled up at some point in the Middle Ages. So Harkham is what we might call a dead hamlet. And this stately home was built in the 1910s So we can be pretty sure that there was no settlement here after the Middle Ages, at least not for a few hundred years, which I find very interesting. Now, does anyone know what this is a map of? Again, audience participation. My throat is getting dry. Any ideas? Okay, I'll give you a clue. It's a very old map, first of all. Not quite, but close, close. And this is north, so north is actually that way. No? Yes, that's Winchester. That's Alresford, that's Alton, and that's Farnham. And the sharp-eyed among you will also notice a red line going through all of these towns. This is the earliest shown map of possibly the A31, but more likely an older route which preceded it. And this route was a major route because it continues on from Farnham up until London. And the origins of this route are likely in prehistory, possibly even the Bronze Age, as a ridge route, because most of this road actually follows quite a prominent ridgeway. However, by the medieval period, it became a major thoroughfare known as the Pass of Alton, especially around the areas of Alton. And this is where the modern name Pace Lane in Medstead derives its name, from the Middle English word pass, basically meaning the way or pass. Now, a very interesting story behind the Alton Pass, the Pass of Alton, is that especially the stretch which went through quite a heavily wooded valley in what is now Chawton, Medstead and Four Marks, was inhabited by medieval highwaymen, one of them, the most famous of which was John Gurdon. And he and his merry men would rob poor passers-by and travellers of their goods. And it is even said that this may be one of the possible inspirations for Robin Hood. It seems this was quite a common act at this time, and most likely that Robin Hood was actually a compilation of many different folklore stories and rural histories that were combined and then set in Nottingham. But it is very possible that Adam of Gurdon was this, who actually comes from Selborne originally, but resided in the Pass of Alton, was one of the many inspirations for Robin Hood. But what about Medstead, which the Pace Lane, the Pass of Alton, goes through? Medstead is recorded quite late for a settlement in 1202. Most other settlements are recorded in the Domesday, which dates around 1086. So Medstead is recorded quite late, and that's because Medstead was, again, another hamlet, which only became its own parish much later, again in the 1800s at some point, and translates as the farmstead in a meadow. And here you can see quite a nice old postcard from Medstead. But all of that, and I haven't even spoken about Ropley, so I'm sure you're quite frustrated. What's a Ropley anyway? So Ropley is mentioned quite late, again, not much earlier than Medstead itself, in around 1172, and translates as Hropper's woodland clearing. Now Hropper, again, similarly, was a local patriarch, possibly a landowner, possibly a father, who knows, definitely a man, but we don't know his standing, we don't know anything about him. And he resided over or owned a small settlement in a woodland clearing. Now, Hropper is actually short for Hrodbjort, which is cognate, basically comes from the same origin as the modern name Robert. And Hrodbjort, directly translated, means the red-bearded one. So that's why I've done my best at doing a sketch of a red-bearded horse rider, an Anglo-Saxon horse rider, who we could possibly imagine as being this Robert. And my scale isn't bad here. This isn't a very small man. No, at this point, horses were actually a lot smaller, and probably in size in comparison to Shetland ponies. So if you think about these Anglo-Saxon warlords, they were actually quite small people because they were smaller than people are today, riding on very small horses. Which I think is very funny to imagine the Battle of Hastings basically being a very small fight. So there we have it. And I've used the best of modern technology to generate an AI image of this possible Ropley, of this settlement in a woodland clearing. Now, by no means did it look like this. There were probably never as many as, 20 huts in this early Ropley, but you can imagine in a densely and thickly forested area, a woodland clearing with a few farms and a few fields as well. This thick forest, this is my last point, by the way, this thick forest, and sorry, I've forgotten the name now. Andreadswold, there we go. Andreadswold was a large stretch of woodland which went possibly as far as Winchester, probably not any further than Winchester, all the way down to the Kent coast in the southeast of England, and was a large, thick forest left by the Romans after their abandonment of England. That basically was the first landscape that these Anglo-Saxons saw. So in this part of Hampshire and Surrey and Sussex, we see a lot of place names which describe woodland clearings or woodlands or lanes through woodlands, which basically all these lanes and all these place names describe at the end of the day. So from all these place names, we can piece together piece by piece what areas, what parts of Ropley looked like in certain periods of time. So we can piece together a relatively densely forested area with woodland clearings, lanes, hamlets here and there, small ponds, so there we have it. That's what a Ropley is, anyway. So thank you very much for listening. I hope you enjoyed it, and happy to take any questions. Any questions at all? So on any of the meanings of place names, if you're interested. Yes.
You showed us a picture of what Ropley might have looked like.
Yes.
Do we know where that is?
Well, I can. Yes. Well, we can. I'd probably put my main bet on Church Street. So I'd say Church Street, basically a few hundred metres down there, was the original Ropley, if you will. However, we can't be sure without archaeological assessment. So when the church burnt down, they did some digs just around the church, and they found only Roman pottery, actually, which is quite interesting, and not a lot of early medieval pottery, which you might expect. And I don't think they found any evidence of an earlier Saxon church on the site, although the Ropley church is quite old. But more often than not, you have a Norman church built on top of a Saxon church, and the Saxon church was almost always built in the settlement, near the settlement. So we can imply that Ropley was there, but it could be Ropley was somewhere else. But we need to dig. Yes? Probably when the vicarage was built there, which I believe was the 16th, 17th century or so. I'm not quite sure. I'm not sure on the earliest mention of the vicarage lane, but yeah, it derives just from the vicarage being there, which probably there would have been some form of vicarage there since the medieval period. But then when the lane was applied, the name, I'm not sure when that first appears, but basically the whole of this stretch, the whole of this road, basically everywhere from where it goes down to the A31, so Berry Hill, Church Street, Lieway Lane, this was all just known as Church Street, the whole stretch of the road. Because again, lane names, they didn't have addresses as such back then, so you didn't need to have discrete lanes. You could use just quite broad names for whole, tens of kilometres of lanes. Yes.
You mentioned Hill Farm Road.
Yes.
The bottom of that is Soames Lane. Is that
Soames Lane, yes.
from a name of person? Or?
Yes, exactly. So it's actually Sims is the first recorded family there. So that's, from my research at least, I think it's the Sims family. And over the years that has corrupted into Soames, and they seem to have lived there at some point in the 16th century, because Soames Farm itself is quite an old building itself. It's a 16th century building, but it doesn't seem to be a hamlet. It just seems to be an isolated farm. But it's, as I say, itself I think is 16th century on the outside, and on the inside it might even be a medieval hall house. It's quite a notable one, actually. Yeah. Yes?
Anything on Gascoigne Lane?
Yes, Gascoigne Lane. Very interesting name, actually. I wish I did that now, actually. Gascoigne Lane is an example of a gentrified lane name. I think Carol actually gave me that word for a gentrified lane name. It's first recorded quite early in the 1400s as Gaston Lane, and Gaston is a very, very common name. It's probably like the second most common name in South England, and it basically just means the enclosure, the grassy enclosure. So basically just a paddock, if you can imagine that. But then that name was used for quite a while, until around the 1800s, when development started on that road, and they didn't want to sell some ugly, common Anglo-Saxon name. They wanted something, French, something romantic. So they were inspired by Gascony, I believe, and they started spelling it as Gascoigne Lane. But yes, ultimately it's just a ugly Anglo-Saxon name.
Somebody did say to me when I first moved here that Gascoigne was an old French word for a milk churn.
Oh, there you go. Very interesting. Very interesting. Maybe they were sold that lie exactly by the person who sold them that house. Yes?
Just a comment on the picture spelling here.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was a kid, we lived in Gascoigne Lake. We had old clothing and and we befriended an old man who lived a bit further down.
Mhm.
He had lived in that house that was burned.
Oh, really? Oh,
And he
wow.
confirmed it was in the 30s. He told me it was in the 30s.
Oh, in the 30s,
And
yeah.
it was totally a total wreck.
Yeah.
Everything gone.
Yeah.
Trenches were on. He moved down to this house
Oh, wow.
in Gascoigne.
Yeah.
And we were friendly with him right through the 60s. He died in about 69.
Oh, wow.
And yeah, the house just confirmed his story.
Yeah. It's,
That pond, when I was a kid, had a house that was a wreck of a house that was tumbling down. Next to it was not a breakage yard, but a dump for cars.
oh, really?
A bus, but it was also a Rolls Royce in there.
This was next to the pond, right next to the pond.
And in the bonnet of the Rolls Royce was a wasp nest. And then suddenly somebody got wise and found it.
Oh, right. Or was this right at the back of the pond behind?
No, it was on the, as you're looking at it from the road, just on the Ropley side, but not too far back.
Oh, really?
No, it was
Right.
obviously out of the water.
I think that was the second house.
Well, I don't know, but
I mean, I can remember the end of the remains.
Oh, really? So there's a structure there.
yeah, well, that's it.
Very interesting. Because if you go into the if you look at the verges of the pond, you'll see lots of broken glass
Yeah.
and all sorts of building materials. Because I think as soon as it burnt, they just whatever was left, they scraped into the pond. But the pond itself is prehistoric. It's when they dredged it in the 70s, they found lots of axe heads and lots of Roman stuff. It's a very ancient pond.
But this old chap, who died, he told us that when he knew the house,
Mhm.
a woman lived in there with children. And it was perfectly serviceable, but it had no floor, it had a chalk floor.
There you go.
And he said it was spots.
Mhm. It's very common. I don't want to give away which house it is exactly, but I've gone to a house where they only not recently, but in the last 40, 50 years they actually put a brick floor on it. But it's very common for even up until the late 1800s for these common rural houses to just be built on soil and then either compacted clay or compacted chalk. And bricks were a luxury and floorboards were a luxury. Yeah, very interesting. Oh, sorry. No. That's right. Yeah. Yeah, that's still right. And there's one literally just on the other side of this window. There's one in the park as well. These two were probably moved from Brightstone Lane. In fact, that's where that story comes from. So it was said that to find out who had the fastest team of cart horses, they would start at Brightstone Lane and then they would transport the stones here. And one team supposedly made it to Dunstall's Lane and the other team made it here. So that's the explanation. Oh, then they moved it. See. Thank you. Yeah, see, I didn't know that. Carol.
You've got an old photograph in the collection that shows Swelling Hill Pond being called Swan.
Mhm.
Swan
Yeah,
Hill Pond.
Swan Hill, yeah.
So, and that's not that long ago, is it?
Yes. So Swan Hill is actually an example of that folk etymology that I mentioned earlier. So again, that's what I was trying to do with the poster, all these weird place names, what does it mean? Is Pies Farm made out of pies? Does Swelling Hill swell? Because to us these days, they're just all names, they're all just funny place names. And so, what happened with Swan Hill is they looked at Swelling Hill, they were like, well, that sounds something like a swan, and there's swans there, so they probably meant Swan Hill. And that's what it's also called corruption, basically, where these names are completely changed because they sound like something else. I wish I used some other examples now, but there's Red Bridge Lane, which is a very short lane near Lieway. There's also, what's it called? Dogford Plantation, the other side of Lieway. These are all corruptions as well. They've got very convoluted spellings, and they thought, well, that sounds like a dog ford, even though there's no ford there, and a dog's probably never been in the woods. So that's where these corruptions come from. So that's the history behind Swan Hill. So yeah. Any other questions? Yeah?
Swan Hill, my parents' grandparents always referred to Swelling Hill as Swan Hill, and the road running across from by the school,
Yeah.
school lane. It
Yeah.
was called Cross Lane.
Cross Lane.
My parents' grandparents always called it Cross Lane.
Yeah.
Presumably it changed when the school was built.
Exactly, yeah. So the school's a relatively new construction. But yeah, Cross Lane is the older name. Cross Lane itself is 16th century. It's the oldest name I could find for it. Probably just referred to that across two lanes. It was a connecting lane. It's quite a short lane, isn't it, school lane? Yeah, very interesting. There you go. Well, thank you so much. Go on.
To support your statement about West Tisted, we do have a so-called 1,330-year-old yew tree.
Yes.
And West Tisted is listed in the Domesday Book,
Yes.
and the beginning of the church is Saxon, and we grew. The port is listed as sponsored by Magdalen College
Exactly.
in 1730.
Yes.
I've contacted them trying to get some idea as to why
Hmm.
they paid for the
Yes.
porch from the church.
Yes.
And they're saying they have no records of that happening.
So yeah, I've actually contacted them as well, and I've looked through their archives, so they don't have any record of that. So it is quite odd that they had anything to do with the church, but like I said, they owned quite a bit of West Tisted, because with the dissolution of the priories in 14-something or other, Selborne Priory, which held these lands in West Tisted, and they held them since the 1200s, if not earlier, all that land was given to Magdalen. And Magdalen held a bit of land locally as well. I think Magdalen held some land in Ropley, so that's why I think at the times the arbiters thought it was a good idea to give it to Magdalen. So Magdalen held a lot of land in West Tisted, but yeah, it makes no sense that they'd then pay for the church, because it's likely that the church was also in the hands of the Tichborne family who lived in the manor right next to the church, which itself was an amazing house until it was destroyed in the 1960s. Very old house, but yes. That's very interesting, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes.
There was another lost pond. There is another, just up the road opposite the forge.
Yes.
When I was a child, that was full of very dirty water. Ducks in it, and yeah, I used to use it to quench his
Yeah, exactly. Or
irons.
as a regular water supply, absolutely, yeah. So that would have probably been sustained this half of Church Street, but also on the other side, there's the town pond. Exactly, which is quite overgrown now. But the houses next to it, they're called the Mere, or the Mere cottages. I think one of them's even called Mere Cottage, and that derives from the same Anglo-Saxon word meaning pond. So again, it's quite an old side, and that's also called Mere Close, the whole area around there. So it's a very old pond, Anglo-Saxon at least.
They used to quench the cart tyres in the pond.
Oh, really?
The old archway, they used to quench the cart wheels there, just opposite
In the Forge Pond.
the... Yeah,
Wow.
there's a little building there.
Oh, right. Wow, I didn't know that. Yeah, no, it's full of history. But yes, any more questions? Yes?
Why doesn't Church Lane lead to the church directly?
Oh, good question. I don't know. It probably... lane names are very difficult because Church Lane, again, is recorded quite early in the 1500s, 1550. But it's possible that Church Lane led some via Cross Lane up there, but it was likely it was just a lane without a name, and at some point it started being called Church Lane, but it didn't lead directly to church, nor was there a church there, nor did the church own land near it. It's probably just led to Church Street, maybe that's why it's called Church Lane, maybe the Church Street Lane, who knows. But yes. Thank you.
Can I just say thank you to you?
Oh, yes.
That was really fascinating. And what's also interesting is these evenings do pull out people who've lived here for a very long time. Don't they? So
Yeah.
it would be very interesting in talking to people.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
But Nanny, thank you so much.
Thank you.